Violence against Hindus and terrible coverage about Hindus is not new, as you can see, because as far back as 1907, there were Bellingham riots in what is today the Washington, Seattle area, and mobs actually drove Hindus from settlements where they used to live, and they were very proud of it. So Hinduphobia is not an new problem, and don't let anybody tell you that or shame you into thinking that this is a made-up issue. So like everything, let's start about defining this term. And we don't need to do that. Academics have done that job for us. There is a website called understandinghinduphobia.org. And this is the definition that they came up with in April of 2021 when they did a conference at Rutgers, defining it as a set of antagonistic, destructive, and derogatory attitudes and behaviors towards Sanatan Dharma Hinduism and Hindus that may manifest as prejudice, fear, or hatred. The website is pretty detailed. I encourage everyone to look at it. It gives a lot of examples on what might be considered Hinduphobia. And I think some of it is obvious, like if somebody comes up to you and tries to hit you saying you dirty Hindu, that is obviously Hinduphobia, and very few would deny it. When a mandir gets attacked and murtis get broken, that is obviously hatred against Hindus. But I think it's also important to remember that Hinduphobia is a lot of things that are not so obvious. So for example, and this happens a lot, when you have academics that deny that Hindus have faced any systemic persecution, that is a form of Hinduphobia. If you try to conflate Indian political issues and make that a Hindu problem, that is a form of Hinduphobia. Erasure of our colonial experience, many other things. I'm not going to go through the list, but I think these are important because I think all of us can relate to people who throw things like sati or caste or cows or bhakt or all of these terms that we're very familiar with. And again, all we are doing here is using these, and the academics have used these in a way and used the same paradigms that the world has accepted for Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and said, hey, we Hindus are not immune to it either, so it's important for all of us to understand. But let's get away from academics and sort of look at what this means for us in our day-to-day lives, because that is where most of us live. And, I think it's very important to start with the educational system because that is what shapes all of us very deeply. And every year, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of Indian students go from India to different universities, Australia, US, Canada, UK, wherever, right? And I don't think many of them realize the deeply biased environment that they're going into because unfortunately, academia has become a deep hotbed of Hinduphobia. And that this is a problem that has developed over the past 20, 50 years. I'm not going to go into that because that could be a standalone talk. But, the culmination of academic Hinduphobia can be looked at in terms of the Dismantling Global Hindutva Conference that happened in August of 2021 on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Now, you can say a lot of things about Hindus or Hindutva or whatever you like, but we had nothing to do with 9/11. And that date, the choosing of that date was very interesting. Dismantling global Hindutva can be looked upon as emblematic of some of the deep Hindu hate that pervades campuses. 50 plus universities, US, Canada, and India got together to sponsor a conference which really kind of trashed Hindu practices, Hindu figures, Hindu deities. And speaker after speaker said that, Hinduism and Hindutva are sort of indistinguishable, and so why don't we dismantle both? And this was particularly ironic because the conference had been held over the protests of Hindus in US and Canada. And the universities had constantly assured us that, look, this is not an attack on a religion, it's a discussion of a political ideology, aka Hindutva. But the speakers themselves showed it to be a plain attack on Hinduism. And unfortunately, there was no price that they paid. They're all still working, happily in their jobs. They've got promotions, grants, whatever. So it just shows you how common and deep Hinduphobia is. That you can do it, you actually get rewarded for it. And I think one critical thing to understand the difference between Hinduphobia and some of the other hates against community that we see is that it comes from the institutions. I talked about academia, it comes from media, it comes from the very groups who normally should be guarding against this kind of hate. And I think that is something that all Hindus need to be very aware of. I ask all students to be aware of it as they go and pursue their education in all the universities, the number of Indians who immigrate outside every year, working on H-1Bs and different kinds of places, you kind of need to know what you're walking into. And I think speaking of academia, right, I think right now we are all seeing what is playing on Western campuses with regard to the Israel-Palestine conflict. But I think it's also brought, and there's been a lot of focus now on how rampant anti-Semitism is on campuses. But if I would direct everybody to look at a paper that Professor Salvatore Babones published a couple of months ago, in which he pointed out the big overlap between the same players who push anti-Semitism, big overlap with those who push Hinduphobia. And you see that because in the university setup, basically, this sort of binary view has come to be adopted, where the world is divided into oppressors and the oppressed. And so once you're put in the oppressor or the oppressed category, logic doesn't matter, facts don't matter. If you're an oppressor, they actually don't care whatever happens to you. They say you deserve everything. And we're seeing that play out in the context of the anti-Semitic protests that are going on, where even the horrific violence that we saw on October 7th is justified on the grounds that, Israel or the Jews have been positioned as the oppressed. Diversity is really challenging these societies. So I think we're finding a lot of the teachers, they'll be putting, conflations between Kashmir and Palestine, or doing teach-ins about caste and Zionism and Hindutva. So everyone needs to really, because this is a growing problem, it's going to amplify unless we all start taking more actions. When you pick up some of the most respected publications in the Western world. So, at the top is a tweet that I think became infamous in India, but this was literally the correspondent of National Public Radio. And in the West, the National Public Radio is seen as, the epitome of diverse views and, the place which is very welcoming and open, but not so much for Hindus, because they have correspondents who basically feel that, if India gives up Hinduism, it would solve all its problems. And her tweet referenced a lot of the, singular Hindu-phobic tropes that are used against us all the time. Dung worshipping, cow piss, all of the famous tropes that, all Hindus need to be aware of. No conversation on Hinduphobia would be complete without a passing reference to media. We're not going to study that today because that's a topic in its own. But I think if you look at the examples I'm sharing here from just the Western media, just a handful of them, it's really important to keep these in mind and see how the correspondents of very respected publications talk about Hindus, Hindu festivals, and the views they hold on Hinduism. And this is really important because most of us get information through the lens and the eyes of these correspondents. And, when these correspondents are so biased, as is obvious in the examples we're seeing here, you really have to start to question everything that they publish and they read. Some of the most egregious examples being from Furqan Khan, who was actually a correspondent for an as respected publication like the National Public NPR. And in the West, in the US, NPR is generally supposed to be where you go to listen to all the kind of hippie, feel good, respecting diversity. But as you can see, there's a huge problem with Hinduism, even among the folks that claim to respect diversity. And then we're in the brave new world because we have the old media, which has been discussed ad nauseum, but we have the new media, which is social media, which everyone is very familiar with, but also artificial intelligence and how that is going to shape our world in the days, months, and years to come. And as you can see, these are some snapshots that I'm sharing from ChatGPT when it launched in 2023. And you can already see the deep-seated bias that has been programmed into this AI engine, because when you ask this AI engine for a joke about, Hindu devis and devtas, it'll happily proffer you jokes on Hanuman, on Shivji, on any others. But when you want a joke on Muhammad or even Jesus, it gives you a very polite decline. Many academics and institutions have refused to accept the fact that Hinduphobia even exists. In fact, if any of you type Hinduphobia into Google or into your Microsoft Word, you'll get that little red squiggly, which means that, the dictionaries and Microsoft and Google, despite being run by so-called Indian and Hindu CEOs, don't even accept that as a valid term. However, I think in this context, it's really important to be aware of a study that was published in 2022 by Rutgers University Network Contagion Research Institute. And this is I think the link should be here. Everyone should download it and read this study. It's not very long, just 20 pages. but it does a great job in analyzing this problem from an academic researcher's lens. And a quick backstory on NCRI. This is a group that just studies hate. That's their charter. So if you Google NCRI, you'll find them quoted a lot in terms of anti-Semitism, anti-Asian hate, anti-police violence, anti-vaccine violence. So it's ideology agnostic. They just study hate wherever they found it. And they happened to start studying hate against Hindus. And the lead researcher, Dr. Joel Finkelstein, was horrified at what he found. And you can Google his talks, but he was just shocked because just he and his team, like many others, were not aware about the deep, deep well of Hinduphobia that exists. And their focus had been on online communities. So they looked at like 4chan, Twitter, and a whole bunch of other online social media platforms. And I think they were just taken aback with the deep, deep, deep levels of hatred against Hindus that they found. And I think that's what the report calls out. And I think a few things to take away from the main thing they found was how Hinduphobia sort of skates under the surface. Many times it's not very obvious. And there's a use of coded terms, imagery, and tropes, which are constantly used over and over again to sort of dehumanize and otherize Hindus. So when I read this report, the term Pajit jumped out. Something and once you realize it, you can't get away from it. Conflation with dirt, filth, cow dung, cow piss, pooping, all of these things. You hear these, you start to pick up these trends in many, many different places. And these are tropes that are used over and over again to make Hindus feel less than totally human. And so that, when something bad happens to Hindus as a human, you don't really respond because, you think they're dirty, filthy people. And when they wrote their report, if you don't have time to read the report, please read the foreword. It was written by the guy who was the Attorney General in New Jersey when Hindus were under attack with the Dot Buster gang. Dot Buster was quite literally a gang that was attacking Hindus for the bindi, the dot, and wanted to bust the head right there. And so this man was the Attorney General, meaning he was prosecuting the gangs and stuff. And he was shocked when he saw these findings. And he said, this is the deployment of that old hate in a new bottle. That's really what's happening here. And NCRI also warned that this kind of online hate, it's not just online. Like we can say, oh, it's all just virtual. How does it matter? No, it actually has impact on real life. And as we look at some of the stuff I'll talk about, they also mentioned, and we certainly agree, that Hinduphobia is, like I've said, dismissed, denied, or understudied in the public world. And there was a big conflation between Islamic networks, white nationalist networks, and other kinds of extremist networks. And they were increasingly using genocidal memes, tropes to spread Hinduphobia. Here are some of the images that the NCRI report found. And you can see that they are like really raw and graphic. Some of these, as the one below makes absolute sense immediately to our viewers in India. This is the iconic image of the 26/11 attacks with the Taj hotel on fire, the troops moving in to help. When we talk about coded imagery, this is an excellent example because I think you all remember this picture. It was just of the troops moving in and some people on the street. But in the images that are portrayed online, the troops have been given an Islamist makeover. And as a result, I found out that Peep the Frog is apparently being co-opted by both white nationalist and also Islamist supremacist networks. So you find that the cops have been given a makeover as the Islamist Peep the Frog. And the victims have been made to look very deliberately Hindu with the brown skin, the swastika, the saffron robes, the bindi or tilak. Whereas, in the Mumbai attacks, people of all faiths died. So this is how coded imagery and tropes work. And this is how people who know nothing about 26/11 Lam, you're really justifying that, these guys deserve to be killed because they're such wretched kind of subhuman beings. Similarly, the very iconic image of George Floyd being murdered by that killer cop. But George Floyd has been substituted for a Hindu. Again, you can see the swastika, tilak, or saffron robes, and the cop has been given an Islamist makeover. And the other one where you actually see the swastika and the Hakenkreuz both together with, a person wearing the Nazi sort of imagery, quite literally putting a gas mask on a person who has been made to look like a Hindu. This is a tweet put out by NASA, the very famous research organization. And they put it out in July of 2021. I just ask everyone to take a look at it and see, is there anything here that could annoy people? Certainly NASA didn't think so. But this tweet triggered and caught the attention of the extremely Hindu-phobic professor Ashok Swain, who apparently was triggered just by seeing this girl in the corner who is seated at her home office with some murtis on her desk. And he put out a tweet on this tweet basically saying, why is a Hindu kid needing to be surrounded by gods and goddesses? Can we do anything without them? What I keep trying to say is Hinduphobia is propagated. This is not an anonymous internet troll. Anybody who advocates for anything knows that, you get targeted. That's not the point here. Here, the targeting happens by an accredited professor at an institute. Ironically, I think he is at the ironically named Peace Studies Institute or something like that. He gets triggered by a young girl in her home office, because this is during COVID time. So she has sent a picture of herself at her home office to her employer. Her employer has no issue with the fact that she has murtis on her desk, because obviously they published a blog about her, which sat on their website for 4 months. Then they used the picture from that blog in their tweet. But the presence of Hindu murtis triggers Professor Ashok Swain so much that he retweets it, and his extremely Hindu-phobic following then got into the act. And if you look at what we are seeing here, it's a sample of the hate that this young girl was subjected to for the next 24 to 48 hours, and the hate that NASA faced simply for having an employee who was somewhat visibly Hindu. Everything from saying, your space programs are going to fail. Why haven't the admins reviewed it? You are at the right wing. This Hindu kid is problematic, and there was way worse. Of course, the favorite trope of caste, bringing in India. By the way, this girl happens to be a second-generation kid, so her connection with India was very tenuous. But I think this was a perfect example of how Hinduphobia can hit anybody. You don't have to be an activist like me. This girl was simply doing what a lot of Indian kids, Hindu kids do, happy in her STEM world, very excited to land an internship with NASA. But it didn't save her, because simply existing as Hindu was annoying enough to others. Then when they try to organize Hindu festivals, students are told, oh, how can you celebrate X, Y, or Z festival when minorities are being oppressed in India? Now, students of no other faith have to face this question. You're allowed to celebrate any festival, because I think for the other faiths, there is an understanding that festivals are different and current political events are different. And I think in a very egregious example, at the OCAD University, there were 2 or 3 Hindu groups that had gotten together to organize a Rath Yatra. And there was a group of like some 20, 30, these standard academics and different organizations, all non-Hindu or some mostly non-Hindu, that got together and put pressure on them saying, don't call it the Rath Yatra. The Rath Yatra, quote unquote, can be an offensive term or a controversial term. So I think this is the kind of encroachment Hindus are facing in their spaces, where you find non-Hindus feeling empowered enough to come in and tell us what we need to call our festivals, asking us to change historic sacred terms, and asking us to not use, the Bhagwad Dhwaj or the Rath Yatra or whatever. So if you allow this stuff to happen, you can see very quickly how this can creep, and, pretty much anything we do can be targeted as being oppressive. This is the first time I heard that the Rath Yatra was now being considered offensive or oppressive. But, there's never a dull moment in the world when Hinduphobia happens. And if you guys think that, it's crazy that these guys were attacked for just celebrating festivals, I want to draw everyone's attention to the fact that, Holi Against Hindutva has now been a part of campus life on like 20, 30 different Western campuses, I think for 3 years running straight. And again, you can have your political ideologies, you can be pro-Hindutva, anti-Hindutva. Honestly, it doesn't matter. Leave my sacred traditions alone. Holi is 5,000-6,000 years old. It has nothing to do with any current trends. And when did you last hear of Eid being targeted or Christmas being targeted or any festival being targeted because some people have an objection with how some people of that religion may be behaving in some part of the world? I mean, it's extreme Hinduphobia when we find ourselves unable to celebrate our festivals or our sacred festivals come under attack simply because somebody has a political problem with some Hindu somewhere in the world. And again, these are not trolls. This, what I'm sharing here, is an article by Equality Labs, which has at this point become quite a well-known and quite a powerful organization in the West. They were basically the sponsor of laws that are now targeting us, the caste issue, which we'll talk about later at a different time. If according to these folks, if you've taken part in Holi, you've been part of an oppressive movement. And the targeting of Diwali. California has a state university system. And in one of the main state universities, UC Davis, there is an officially sponsored student body organization called Other Collective. And they put out this Instagram post, which basically said when Hindus celebrate Diwali by decorating our homes, eating sweet, bursting crackers, praying to our quote-unquote casteist gods, naturally all these actions that we take are offensive to Dalits and Muslims and Bahujans and Adivasis. When I saw this Instagram post, I was just flabbergasted. I said, you know what? If you're telling me that my existence and my prayers and my decorating my own house is offensive to somebody else, that just shows the extent of hate that our community is dealing with. And I'm sorry, but if my existence is offensive to somebody, I think I refuse to stop existing just to make them happy. But these are all examples of Hinduphobia, and this is what the students who actually get together on campuses and try to do a Diwali celebration or a Rath Yatra start to face, because this is the sort of hate that is being percolated by officially sanctioned bodies and also by professors, which we won't go into today.